Aubrey Topknot had gone missing. He said he was just checking his stash in a safe area, so he went out alone. I ain't seen him in a few days since then, so I went looking. I checked Topknot's stash in the Ural truck, but it was cleared out. No sign of him or his stuff. I didn't have to look far, actually. Just behind the crashed Bronya transporteur, he was there. An empty pistol in one hand and an empty bottle in the other. And just as I was thinking how I was out here in the zone myself, breaking my own rule, I heard footsteps behind me. Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and several of the models featured in today's video have been kindly provided to me from Ft.Modern-Miniatures.EU. I will have a link in the description below. Some of the models are in that quite useful but not exciting category. There are some tree trunks, drain cover, a weapons pack, and, quite appropriately for the zone, a campfire accessories pack. And these are all really nice pieces with good detail, and the pre-supported versions have all come out really nicely, and all of the stuff that I don't use in today's video will be in my bits box for future projects. The big cool models, however, are the BTR-80 and the Ural truck, classic Soviet-era vehicles that will fit perfectly into Zona Alfa or Stalker or similar themed gaming boards. Both of these have really nice sharp detail that take painting nicely and are visible from gaming distances, as we'll see later on when I paint them up. This type of detail can look great if you're the type of painter to spend a long time weathering and texturing, but it also looks plenty nice enough with the simple techniques that I like to use. One thing I found interesting was the way that these models are hollowed. Rather than providing a solid model and allowing your slicer to auto hollow, which is pretty easy but can cause some occasional issues, these models from Modern Miniatures come pre-hollowed and with a big open slot on the underneath, and that makes it far easier to clean it and far easier to cure it on the inside. Much better to deal with than the usual circular holes you end up cutting with your slicer. Certainly a useful feature. I did notice another 3D print helping aspect of these with the climbing handles on the BTR's hull. These are very thin and kind of weak, and so they have a sort of extra sliver of material added as support. And this is supposed to make them easier to print, and it will crack away and cut nicely to leave the handle in place. Unfortunately, in my case, I found these a little too fragile and ended up cutting those away. I also found that one of the side mirrors on the Ural truck broke away, but that's almost certainly because I'm quite aggressive with cleaning and shaking the pots as I'm cleaning the models. The BTR hull comes as a single piece with wheels and separate turret, but the Ural comes in a couple of pieces, and I glued the frame to the cab with the wheels dry fitted so I could make sure it all lined up. But while I was test fitting all of this, I noticed that the Ural was a little big, and so I asked Modern Miniatures what the scale was on the models, and the answer was 1:50, which explains why it seems a little big, as I usually work in the slightly smaller 1:56 scale. I wondered just how different that difference is and how far I could push these models from Modern Miniatures, and so I printed a bunch of the BTRs in different scales. First one is in native scale, and the Ural also printed in native scale as well. I have some true scale 28mm models here sneaking in from World War II, and they just seem tiny in comparison to both of these vehicles. Here are some Stalkers, and these are hero scale 28mm, which looks a little better because they're a little bulkier, but for me, they're a little short in comparison. When I bring in the BTR I printed scaled down about 10%, the hero scale models now look just right. They're the right height, nice and chunky and heroic, and this is what I prefer. I also printed a 1:100 scale and a 1:285 scale model, although they'll be more visible once I paint them later on. Let's get to painting. I recently picked up a green primer, and it's quite a saturated green, and so I airbrushed on a very thin coat of some warm brown. This is going to act more as a filter than a base coat, muting the green without totally obliterating it. I now wasn't too fussed about having a consistent coat. I didn't want a consistent coat, as the natural variation that I'm going to add in here with the airbrush is going to improve the overall messy, dirty look that I'll end up with later on. One last little quick step with the airbrush is going to be very familiar to my audience: a modulation highlight on the middle of each armor panel and body panel on the vehicles. To change things up a little bit, I wanted to try a slightly more deliberate weathering technique than what I'm used to with other vehicles that I painted on the channel before. So instead of stippling, I'm actually lining in some scratches with black, and I'll finish those off later on, but at the moment I'm just putting a lot of black lines over any part of the model that I think would take damage over the years, stones kicked up from the road while driving, or hatches being opened and closed over the years. I was stuck for a while, decided whether I want to douse them all in a black wash or douse them all in a brown wash. Well, why not both? By mixing about a quarter of black for that deep darkness with 3 parts of brown for the warmth, that gave me a really gritty reality is brown effect that'll fit nicely into the zone. And that big open slot does help hold on to the models as well. Tidying up the wash and finishing off the painted shape with an edge highlight is also going to be extremely familiar to my audience, but I just really like this style, so shush, let me enjoy it. But I'm not done quite yet. I have some final details to fill in, and those scratches to finish off. I had intended to paint silver here over the scratches within the black lines that I had painted earlier. However, it didn't necessarily always work that way. Painting thin lines can be quite difficult, especially where there's no easy way to fix the black without reapplying a wash, and then that leads to more issues with layers and opacity, and so I just kind of accepted where it ended up. Any place where I missed slightly and put the silver line over the edge of the black, it sort of adds a slight 3D effect, looking like a scratch that's reflecting light from one side. This much brighter silver, compared to how I usually paint kind of weathering and stuff on vehicles, is a really nice strong bit of contrast, and so I'll probably include this type of thing in models and scratches on vehicles in the future. Painting the headlights and some other bits, I just had the windows of the Ural truck left to paint. And I bounced between a few different styles for painting non-transparent model in glass or transparent materials painting styles. And this time I'm going to go for something really simple that will hopefully not seem too obtrusive when we're done, even if it's not necessarily perfectly realistic. I hit all of the windows with a base coat of a blue-grey and then glazed on a very bright blue over the top of that, and I tried to focus this on the lower half of all of the windows and a little bit up the edges as well. This actually took several coats of glazing, as obviously glazing is quite thin, and I think actually at the end I might have pushed this to even more layers, but it worked out well how it worked out. Just like my original green was way too saturated, this blue is also way too saturated, and so I thinly filtered it with some blacking, which, oops, a bit too thick there, but spreading this around gave me just about the look I was after. There was a minor print imperfection on the windscreen, but rather than ignore it or try and repair it, I instead decided to include it as a feature of the model. First with a light grey, and then with black, I spidered out a crack in the glass. A stone strike or a bullet hole perhaps. The black here, similar to my silver earlier, was quite difficult to place exactly how I wanted it, but essentially I tried to paint the lower edge of each light grey line with a thin stripe of black, allowing that strong contrast to make the crack visible. I also painted the window frames in black, as everyone looks better in mascara even vehicles. So that's the models complete, and like I said, even with my quick and messy techniques, these models do look quite nice. Usable for models in game, and certainly as big scatter pieces. Back to mentions of scale just quickly. The small ones are actually even more interesting than I had thought earlier. The 1:100 scale one came out almost perfectly, except where I didn't support it properly. Even the autocannon barrel and even the coax machine gun barrel, and all of the detail on the hull is just spot on. When I went all the way down to 1:285 or 6mm scale, this is really tiny, and the gun barrels have unfortunately failed, and the whole thing is a little soft due to how thin the walls are now because of the pre-hollowed and scaling down. But that's actually pretty easy to fix. Pack it with Milliput and replace the barrel with a pin. The detail coming out so nicely, but 3D printing is such a great technology, and these models are designed just spot on for it. Oh, but hey, there's more runtime left on this video, so let's look at the next part of the project. I mentioned at the start that Modern Miniatures sent me a selection from their website, and one of those was the Dead Scavengers. Well, that's going to be far more interesting of a paint job than the vehicles that I paint in the same way that I paint every other vehicle on the channel. This particular one has a big warm jacket, torn trousers, a gas mask, and I can easily separate these out with different colours to make the model seem nice and visually interesting. I started with the coat, a dark brown base coat, and some simple orange highlights mixed over a few layers. The orangey brown highlighted with white is perfect for the bandage on the leg and the furry cuffs of the coat, and I had some of the light blue grey still on my wet palette from painting the Ural's windscreen, so that quickly went on the gas mask. I tried to preserve the lenses and filter, but I ended up having to repaint those, so that's not really a big issue. As I went back for some extra highlights, I realised I was enjoying painting this specific model. The details are just so lovely and crisp, a testament to the modern style of sculpting that grabs paint in a satisfying way, and to the quality of these models from Modern Miniatures. Now, this next part of the video might be difficult to follow visually due to the wonky camera work. I'm not a proper YouTuber, so I'll try to explain. I broke out half of my kitchen supplies for this, starting by wrapping one of the BTR holes in cling film. You may have noticed earlier that I painted two of the BTRs that I scaled down by 10%. This is because the first one had actually had some pretty bad print imperfections and I wanted a nicer one for the video. But the not so nice one will make a lovely terrain piece, but as I've painted it, I don't want to ruin it, hence wrapping it in cling film. The structure of the base here is a big blob of sprue goo. I've done a little work with sprue goo for basing and terrain in other videos, and I will certainly be revisiting that soon. I prefer the uneven shapes that the sprue goo creates rather than the perfectly round or oval that you can get from pre-made bases. I've already put one layer of a cheap air drying clay to form somewhat of a mound of earth. As this clay is pretty inconsistent, it takes a while to dry and it often cracks. So I work in multiple layers and so it can dry and I can fix cracks as I go along. I created some voids with some tin foil, also from the kitchen. This is just to add some physical volume so it doesn't need to dry as much and will reduce cracking. Like I said, it's hard to see what's going on, but I'm essentially trying to bury any part of the model that has the print imperfections and smush the clay up the sides to make it look like the BTR has crashed and skidded into some dirt and half buried itself. Something model was telling a story, something. As the BTR, tree trunk and dead scav were all covered in cling film, they left the perfect impressions in the clay without sticking so that I could separate them and add some texture over the top of the clay. In this case, I'm going over about 3/4 of the clay with super glue and then sprinkling on a little bit of different sizes of aggregate. The smallest here is sand, which will look like gravel, and some various rocks that will have been dislodged from the ground as the BTR crashed, and a couple of larger rocks as well. After priming grey, I unceremoniously glopped on some cheap craft paint anywhere that I hadn't coated with the gravel and rocks, and this will be my mud. I didn't even need a texture paste, as both the clay and the sprue goo left naturally even textures that just look really good, with a simple bit of paint and some grass that I'll add later. Equally, some cheap black graph paint went all over the rocks and gravel, and that took a little while to dry. This whole project is turning into a hectic 20 minutes of work, followed by I'll come back to it tomorrow. Similarly to how I've painted stonework before, and in the exact same way I do to my Stalker model bases, I simply dry brushed the rockery with a light grey, creating a dusty, high contrast effect. For some of the more prominent features and rocks, I made sure that they got a nice coating of the grey so that the edges stand out nice and strongly. Unlike my usual cheap options, this time I'm going for some actual model making products, shock horror. This is a mix of some Geek Gaming Scenic Space Ready and some Gamer's Grass flower tufts. These really add a lot of variety, especially those saturated yellow flowers, over a mostly desaturated everything else in this project. And there we go, my little fallen stalker vignette is complete. Now I have a good condition BTR hull and an Ural to use as either vehicles in game or as terrain, and of course the nice little crashed BTR as a diorama or terrain piece, or even an objective marker to collect loot from. Adding to the couple of buildings that I have that suit the theme and the anomalies that I'm working on, I have quite the collection of Stalker or Zona Alfa adjacent terrain to make a gaming board out of. The one thing I think it lacks is cohesion. I have a lot of cool individual pieces, but they don't all fit together as well as I'd like. If you have any suggestions on how to join these pieces together and how to make them look cohesive, let me know in the comments below. And check out the description on the way past for a link to Modern Miniatures website. Tell them thank you for passing the models on to me to make the video today. So with all that sorted out, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.